I want to thank everybody for coming out this evening. This is a great crowd. I think this is really important information that everybody needs to have as we move forward in the school system and as we follow some of the legislation that happens in the State House. So tonight, our purpose is to really go over what the blueprint for Maryland's future is. Many of you may have heard that term and maybe not knew what it was about or have heard rumors about what it's about. So hopefully tonight we can clear some of that up and you'll have a chance to ask any questions you may have about it and how it will affect your child's school. Also, I know that there are some staff here tonight. I saw some staff filtering in. Just an FYI, we will be having a town hall just for staff of CCPS on April 27th after school that day. So if you're here and you're wondering, you know, will you get more information or information more specifically for staff? Yes, that's coming. So hold on for that. But we want you to be able to engage with the information tonight. And we also want to manage your expectations of what Blueprint and the implications will be for your child's school. What I don't want to be is a fearmonger, but I also don't want to get to September of 2024 and have parents calling and saying, you know, why are the class sizes so much bigger in my child's school this year? We want you to know ahead of time what this legislation is and what the implications are, how that might change what you're normally used to seeing in the schools. So the Blueprint for Maryland's Future was enacted in 2022 as a sweeping reform of pre-K through 12 public education. So it has authority over basically all educational policy and how we spend our money. It includes what we will be able to offer and how we will pay for that. So this is taking a blueprint legislation, which is tons and tons of pages, and basically showing you what the simplified version is. So the blueprint policy areas are early childhood. Some of you may have heard that this will expand full-day pre-K to 4-year-olds and 3-year-olds in a public-private partnership. We're working through those details now. The second area of blueprint talks about high quality and diverse teachers and leaders. It requires us to increase staff diversity and to create a career ladder and minimum salary structure for our teachers. The third area is college and career pathways. So basically, it expands post-high school pathways, and it also expands the opportunity for our students to take college-level coursework or a career in tech industry certification. And finally, the last bullet, or the last area, talks about more resources to ensure that all students are successful. So it increases funding and programming for specific populations of students. So under Blueprint, we need to spend more money than we're spending now, or more funding than we're spending now, on students who are English language learners, students who receive special education services, and students who receive free and reduced meals. In the education industry, we call those FARMs, free and reduced meals, students who get those free and reduced meals. In the Blueprint, that's called compensatory education. So whenever you hear the term compensatory education, we're talking about more resources for students who receive free and reduced meals. So those are the 4 main areas of the legislation. The accountability that goes with Blueprint, with us implementing Blueprint implementation, is nothing like we've ever seen in the past. And this is where things really change. So this isn't guidance from the state. This is law. This has passed through the General Assembly, and we need to implement it. So basically, there's been established a new State Accountability and Implementation Board. Many of you may have heard the acronym, the AIB. This is the Accountability and Implementation Board, and they oversee us implementing this blueprint program. They have absolute authority on how we implement this. So as we implement, we have to turn in indicators that show that we are implementing this as it was suggested that we do in the law. There's also program accountability. This requires an annual local implementation plan for all of our blueprint policies. The AIB may withhold funding based on our implementation. So we have just turned in our first blueprint plan to the state, and we're waiting for feedback from turning that in. We don't know if it will be accepted or if it will have to be revised. But MSDE will be able to look at it, the Maryland State Department of Education, and the AIB, and they will determine whether we're doing what we're supposed to be doing with the law and with our funding. If they decide that we're not doing what we're supposed to be doing, they can withhold 25% of our state funding. Again, we've never had anything like that before, so that's very, very new for us. For fiscal accountability, our funds must be reported and spent within each program area and at the school level. So of the funding that we get, we have to prove that we're spending the right amount on students that are English language learners, students who receive special ed services, and students who receive free and reduced meals or compensatory education. If we don't, they can withhold more money, more funding. So it's vital that we make sure that we're following the law and that our plan is approved. So pre-blueprint, the way that we were funded was we got funding from the state and we got funding from the locals, our commissioners, and we put that funding together, and then we prioritized how that funding was spent throughout the school system. That's how we've always done our funding and always done our budget. We could spend the state or the local funds on anything that was a priority. It could be health insurance, it could be salaries for our employees, it could be services for students, it could be for more teachers. Anything that we needed in the school system. It could be for buying chairs and tables. And county funds were not subject to the state requirements. Now, even the funds that we get from the county are subject to the restrictions of the state. That's very different. On this same note, with our funding in the past, we have always made the decision to staff all of our schools pretty equally based on numbers of students and based on the students that were in those schools. So every school could function basically at the same level. Then if we had any extra funding, we could put that extra funding into specific schools that held students who were economically disadvantaged. So we were able to make that decision, but off the top, we made sure that all of our schools were funded to an adequate degree. Blueprint directs us to fund our schools differently. So instead of funding our schools pretty equally like we did, they're directing us to fund our schools equitably. And that's where it may affect or it will affect the resources that you see at your child's school. Some schools may increase dramatically in the resources and staffing they see. Other schools may decrease dramatically. So now there's this new formula that I just talked about. Both the state and local funds are subject to the new requirements. The funds have to be spent in the areas that they say they need to be spent in. And at the local level, all of the changes that have to be made at the school level goes into effect in FY25. So basically, on July 1st of 2024, we have to have our plan ready for how the schools are going to be staffed to implement Blueprint. The good news is this gives us a year and 4 months to figure out how we're going to meet the demands of Blueprint and make sure that our schools have adequate staffing, that all of our schools have adequate staffing and resources. So to be compliant with Blueprint, we're going to have to redistribute funding and resources across our schools. As I said, we're going to have to distribute our resources equitably, not equally. The largest change in compliance is this last bullet. We need to spend $48 million of the money that we currently have and are spending on all kinds of other things like, salaries and chairs and heating and air conditioning and salaries. We have to spend $48 million of that money on compensatory education. What that means is we have to take $48 million from everywhere and make sure that it's directed to the schools who have the most students who receive compensatory education funding. In other words, the schools that have most students who are economically disadvantaged. Again, this isn't new money. The only new money there is in that $48 million is $11 million. So they're going to give us $11 million in new funds. This is from the state. But $37 million of that is existing funds that are being used for all kinds of other things to keep our school system afloat and running. If there are no changes to the Blueprint structure or increases in local revenue, we're going to need to reprioritize our current spending so that we can find $37 million that we're going to pull out of all of the other schools to give it to the schools who require compensatory education funding. And since approximately 80% of our total annual budget is spent on staffing, it's going to end up being staffing. So staff are going to need to be shifted from schools with fewer numbers of economically disadvantaged students to schools with larger numbers of economically disadvantaged students. Again, this is a complex law, and I'm trying to kind of shave it down to the simplest form so that everybody can kind of get an idea of what this might look like. So to help, we came up with an example for you to kind of think through with us for the 2024-2025 school year. Again, what I'm going to show you here is just an example. I'm going to try not to, I'm hoping that I don't go home tonight and see on Facebook this a post of this is what staffing is going to look like in the 24-25 school year. Superintendent McCabe said so tonight at the town hall. That's not true. As we look at the numbers, there are lots of ways to interpret what we have to do, but this is one of the most simplified ways to see it. Again, we also have a year and 4 months to work with the Maryland State Department of Education on this plan. And we meet with them about once a week for technical assistance, because as you can imagine, when a new law drops, there's a lot of questions to be answered. And so that's the place that we're in right now. And we hope to have all of that done and ready to be implemented, like I said, by July of 2024. Now we're going to take a look. So in this example of what could happen, you're going to see, let's look at Tawnytown, the first line. Tawnytown Elementary School. This year, the 22-23 school year, they have 19 full-time teachers. That's what FTE stands for, full-time equivalency for teachers. If we do everything the way Blueprint directs us to do, they have a projected teacher FTE of 30.97 teachers to implement Blueprint. What that means is they go from a staff of 19 to a staff of 40. So that's a difference of about 11 or 12 teachers. Now, you might think, we don't even have space for that many teachers. Exactly. We don't. We do not have space for that many teachers. We're not going to have space for that many teachers in 2024-25. So we are meeting every day trying to work through what that's going to look like. How many teachers will be in one classroom? How many small groups will be pulled? Will these all be teachers in reality? Again, this is just an example. We could decide that teachers are going to be used, assistants are going to be used, other staff are going to be used. But right now, this example is just looking at teachers. Looking at the second row, so, and I won't go through all these, but again, just to make sure everybody understands, Robert Moten still has, right now has 19 teachers. They're slotted to have about 30 teachers under Blueprint, which is a change of about 10 to 11. Now, what I'm really concerned about is that if you look down at the bottom, let's look at Freedom Elementary. They currently have 27 teachers. They are projected to have 18.33 teachers under Blueprint implementation. So that's a negative difference of about 8 or 9 teachers. Now, you're probably sitting there thinking, how would they even run the school? That's exactly what I'm thinking. We're all thinking that. Because if you think about losing 9 teachers, that would be very, very large class sizes. We don't even know that we could fit all of the students who would need to fit in the classroom and still meet fire code. That's where we are at this point, is logistically, would this even work? Not even thinking about what instructional practices or what's best for students. Right now, we're thinking logistically, could this even work? You see that Carrolltown is in a similar situation, and as you go up the chart, the landscape looks better if you're that school. Here's the same middle school example. It's the same example just for middle school. So this includes all the academic sections at middle school, and you'll see the same thing happening. Northwest Middle currently has 37 teachers. They're slated to have 44 to 45 teachers, difference of about 7 teachers. And then if you look at Oklahoma Road, on the other end of the scale, they've got 36, 37 teachers now. They're slated to have 29. They're slated to lose 7 or 8 teachers. Again, how do you create middle school teams that can function with that few teachers? Which is what we're working on and working with the state on. And then finally, here's the same example at high school. So at Francis Scott Key, they currently have 46. They're projected at 58 with a difference of plus 12, gaining 12 teachers. Liberty, on the other hand, looks to be losing about 10 or 11 teachers. Now at the high school, this is even more, this affects not only class size at the high school, but it also affects all credit-bearing courses. Because if you think through it, if a high school like Liberty or Century has to lose a good number of teachers, that means that they can't offer all of the courses that they currently offer. So we'd really be looking at making sure that those schools who are losing a good number of staff are offering the courses that would have to be offered for graduation requirements. Instead of offering some more of those courses that are more popular with students, but don't necessarily have to be taken to graduate high school. So that's the example of the resource situation as far as moving things from one school to another school in order to especially make the compensatory education blueprint requirement happen. On top of that, there are some other challenges that come with Blueprint. And I want to reiterate here that, and if I didn't say this in the beginning, I should have. Blueprint, I think, is trying to do good things for education. I think the people I think the legislators thought that they were doing something good, but I don't necessarily know that all of the implications or downstream consequences were, really came up at the time. And that's what we're dealing with now, is how to implement something. So what I'm going to go over now is the funding challenges that deal more with staffing. And again, these aren't bad things. The challenge is, how do we afford them? How do we pay for them? So the first one doesn't have to do with staffing, but it has to do with our students and their opportunities to take dual enrollment and become college and career ready. Some of you may already know this, but for some of you, this may be new information. Under Blueprint, the districts have to pay 75% of tuition and fees for any student who wants to take a dual enrollment course, and the community college has to pay 25%. That means that you as the parent don't pay anything if you want your child to be enrolled in a dual enrollment course in college. The problem with that is that next year we anticipate it's probably going to cost us about $1.5 million to implement this. And again, we don't have a choice. This is the law. And if you can imagine, that $1.5 million, again, has to be taken from something that we're already paying for in order to put it into dual enrollment. For the second bullet, by June 30th of 2024, we have to have satisfied the 10% teacher salary increase that the Blueprint mandates. So we had between 2019 and 2025 to get that done, and we're in between right now trying to make that happen. By July 1st, 2024, we have to implement a new career ladder for teachers. Again, this is a good positive thing, but it will cost money. We'll have to place our teachers now on different tiers of a career ladder. And the reason for the new career ladder is to reward teachers for staying in the classroom, which I think is a wonderful thing to do. I don't think it's a bad idea, but again, it comes with cost. For the fourth bullet, by July 1st of 2026, the base teacher salary will need to be $60,000. Again, I think this is a great thing, but the money has to be there in order to do it. Just this bullet, the $60,000 base pay for teachers by fiscal 2027, that adds approximately $30 million to our local budget that we didn't have before. And finally, we need to begin to address the requirement that 60% of a teacher's time is spent on instructing students, while 40% of a teacher's time is spent on collaboration and planning. Again, this is in the law. We are not close to this right now. And in order to get close to this, the only way to do this is to hire more teachers so that more work, more instruction can be spread out among more people. And so to do this is going to require us to hire about 125 more teachers. I'm not sure where they're coming from because nobody can find anybody to fill jobs right now. I don't think that's just an education thing. But we're going to have to find 125 teachers, and just this part of the requirement would cost us about $10.7 million to implement. So when you look at the $37 million that we talked about earlier to make sure that we're not having to strip all the other schools of their staff and resources in order to concentrate them in certain areas. And then you look at this page where we've got, $30 million for the teacher raises and 10.7 for teacher planning time requirements. We're really looking at an uphill struggle to implement. And as I said earlier, this is not something that we can say we can't implement this. This is something that we have to find a way to do. And we've been in many, many talks with the state every week, every month in our meetings, trying to figure out how to do it and how other systems are doing it. So all of the school systems in Maryland are working together to find ways to make this law, to put this law into action. And as you can see, it's going to be a challenge. Like I said, we have a year and 4 months before we have to start moving staff around to look at the comp ed piece of it. So we have some time. You're not going to see a difference in your child's class size or resources next school year. I'm trying to get out in front of this so that we have enough time to, for everybody to understand what this means and to work with our locals and our state officials before it has to be implemented. So with that, I know that was a lot of information to digest. But at this time, we'd like to do a question and answer session. We've got staff here who can answer any questions. I'd also like, before anybody comes forward to ask any questions, I'd like to just say thank you for Commissioner Ed Rothstein for being here tonight. I know some of you saw him when you came in, and Board President Marcia Herbert and Board Member Steve Whistler for being here as well. I also have members of Cabinet here tonight to answer the questions that you bring forward. Again, I know that was a lot of information, and you're probably on information overload right now, and it might take a little bit of time to process what you just heard. And if that's the case, that's okay. You can always email any of us, and we will get back to you to answer any questions. But since we're here, any questions you have, we'll answer. If you are called on, just come up to the center podium here. The reason for that is this is being recorded tonight, and that way people who watch can hear your questions and answers. And that may actually really help someone at home who is concerned about the same thing. Yes, come on up. And if there's a lot of people who want to speak, you can actually just make a line.
Hi, Mary Beth Stile, Eldersburg resident. You may have addressed this, so please forgive me if you did, but is that last bullet addressed in the example staffing that you presented in the earlier charts?
Yeah.
Or, okay.
So that's a very good question. Thank you for asking that question. That last bullet where we talk about 60% instructional time and 40% planning time for teachers, that bullet is not even taken into consideration yet when I showed you that example. That example is just looking at that $37 million that has to move around that we currently have spent in other places around the county. Yes.
So before showing the example, the projections of what could happen, there was a bullet point that didn't take into account some of the variables that would impact that. So I don't know if you could address what some of those variables might be for the positive for us and what maybe parents could do to help influence those variables in a positive direction, whether it's action at the county level or action at the state level.
You know, some of the variables could be, you know, if there were less restriction in how we use the funding from the state. I don't know that that's going to happen. I don't have any indication that that's going to happen. But, you know, that may happen, or we may get different guidance in the next year and 4 months. Or, you know, maybe there's a district that comes up with a great idea that we're able to utilize for our school system, since we are all working together and we're all in the same circumstance. As far as, you know, the state goes, the funding formula from the state is done in the legislature. So it's not even like the State Board of Education or MSDE that decides how much money each school district gets. That's a formula that's done in the General Assembly, in the State House. So in order to change the formula, the law has to change. So the only way to get that done is if you wanted to contact local legislators to tell them about your concern over the funding formula in the state. As far as local funding goes, we are working with our local commissioners on this. We've had 2 joint Board of Education, Board of County Commissioner meetings just about funding for the blueprint. And we are in regular communication about it. So, you know, I know our commissioners are in a tight spot as well, since they're having to try to find funding for the new fire and EMS project that was approved. So I know that they're trying to balance a lot as well. But at this point, the only way for us to, I'll put it this way, the more funding that we can get from our locals, and I'm talking in the out years, not just FY24, but really FY25 and out, is if they come through for us so that we don't have to take so much money from other schools. So that will be that $37 million that I showed you up there. If they can somehow, you know, work in that gap, the less we're going to have to move from one school to another school. So that's really where it happens. Yes, Amy?
Could you just address why this is different in Carroll County than it is in some of the other surrounding counties? I know I've heard a lot of chatter about other counties being trained on all of this already and taught, you know, and things like that. And I know from listening that we have a different challenge because of our county's makeup and because of that formula that you mentioned. And also just because of what kind of staffing level we're already at and other financial challenges from past years and things. So we're in a different situation than a lot of the surrounding counties.
Yes, thank you. So first, you know, state funding, our funding from the state, what they look at when they decide how much they need to give us is one of the things they need to look at, or they do look at, is our wealth index. So as a county, we're a pretty rich county in comparison to the other 23 districts in Maryland. So if you can think of some other districts in Maryland that are not as wealthy, you would see that they are getting more funding from the state directly. There's less put on the local government to fund education. But when they look at our wealth index, they say, you're a wealthy county, you can afford more than maybe another county that's not as wealthy. So that's one thing that hurts us as a district as far as funding goes, state funding. But also we're in a very interesting situation here in Carroll. For the past, I would say 15 years, maybe more, in order to make the budget balance, we've cut staffing. And so we've cut in all over the last 15 years, was it, Mr. O'Neill, 300? Just about 310 positions across the county. And what that means is our custodians are responsible to clean more area. Our teachers are required to teach more students in their classrooms. About 220 was instructional with teaching positions, correct?
Teaching or other class, could have been assistant.
Yeah. So about 220 of those over 300 positions were instructional positions that we cut. And we did that because we had to do it. We had to do it to balance the budget. But if you think about it, that puts us in a precarious position right now because other systems that didn't have to cut 300 positions over the past 15 years now have 300 positions worth of money to spread out all over their county so that they don't have to move as many staff from one school to another school. And I'll give an example of that. Let's say we had not had to cut 300 positions. And so I had very small class sizes already, and I also had more resource teachers in every school. Perhaps I had 2 or 3 reading specialists and math specialists at every school. What I could do in the snap of a finger would be to say, okay, class sizes are going to go up, but not crazy. They're going to go up, and we're going to have fewer resource teachers outside of the classroom. I'm going to pull those and make them classroom teachers again. That's what a lot of the districts around us are doing. And that way, they're not having to pull 8 teachers from a particular school. They're taking staffing that they have had in other places, and they're pulling those and saying, you're not going to be doing the jobs that you do right now. We're going to put you in the classroom over at this school so that we don't have to move staffing and move resources around. We are the leanest district out there. And so we don't have that kind of staffing to get creative with. I will say that one district in particular is getting creative, and in Garrett County, they've decided to close their middle schools. They will have no more middle schools, and their elementary schools will be pre-K through 7, and their high schools will be grade 8 through 12. And that's because they have room in their schools to do that. We wouldn't even have the room to do that, even if that came up as an idea that we wanted to use, which it's not. So I don't want to see that on Facebook tonight. But, that's another example of, how districts are trying to get creative to make this work. I wish we didn't have to have cut everything we cut, because then we could get creative and have less of an impact on each of the schools that are losing staff. But unfortunately, that's where we are at this point.
Hi, I think I heard you say that we have a year and 4 months to put the plan together. How long do we have after that to execute the plan or become compliant? And then the second part of that question is, what happens if we don't?
Okay, so we have a plan. We had to turn in the first iteration of our blueprint plan last week. Now, that doesn't move anybody around. That's just for next school year. It's the following school year, 24-25, where we haven't turned in our plan for that yet. But we have time to figure out how that's going to look and be able to work with our communities to manage those expectations and try to find solutions in the interim. If we can't find a way to make it work, then I go back to the slide of blueprint accountability. That's where the state can take 25% of the funding that they already give us, and more if we're not implementing in the way that they see fit. So we haven't heard any other anything else besides you need to implement or else there will be this accountability. My hope is that as we move forward, we will continue to get guidance from the state and maybe there will be a change. But at this point, we haven't gotten any kind of relief for how we need to spend the money. Yes.
Hi, Melissa Isvanek. Can you clarify who qualifies for compensatory education? Because at the beginning you said it's ELL, farms, and special ed, and then when you showed us all the slides, you said it was only for farms.
So that's a good question, and I must have misspoke. So English language learners are a separate category. Students who receive special ed services are a different category. And then students who are compensatory ed are a separate category. Okay. Now, that's not to say that there might not be a student who fits all three. But as far as the funding goes, there are three different silos.
Okay, so when we're looking at the funding for schools, that's only to do with farms.
Yes, the example I showed only deals with farms or compensatory education. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Good evening. My name is Cindy Porter, and I'm president of CASE that represents assistants, clericals, and LPNs in our school system. And this is a plan that is going to be with our county for 10 years. And it's important that everyone knows that we're talking about funding and the need for funding across our school system and county for this time period. And the blueprint has virtually eliminated anything to do with the support staff in your schools. So please also keep that in mind when we're looking at funding and how we're going to fund things and sources of funding, because support staff is an important part of your child's education every day. Thank you.
Cindy, that's a really good point. And I would add to that when we do actually implement whatever plan that we come up with and we have to implement in 24, 25, we won't probably just be talking about teachers. We will be talking about support staff. We could be talking about guidance counselors, any staffing resource that students enjoy in a school. Yes.
First of all, Superintendent, thank you for coming and speaking tonight. I know it's difficult to stand in front of such a large group of people and frankly deliver such bad news. My question is, if the state is threatening to withhold 25%, what is that number and how does that compare to the numbers that we need to make up?
Cindy was telling me to jog. Good evening, John O'Neill, Assistant Superintendent of Operations for the Superintendent. So the question was, if the penalty is 25%, why is that? What does it look like? So just to clarify a bit, the law is written that way. So the AIB, the new board that the superintendent referred to, starts out every fiscal year sort of automatically withholding 25% of your new funding. And so that would be state aid. So in a given year, that could be, if it were this year, it'd be maybe somewhere around $5 million. And then if the AIB feels like you've complied with your plan, they could automatically release that funding or not. There's a lot of other talk, even in Annapolis right now, sort of beyond the mechanism of how the blueprint works, of what happens with a Board of Ed or a school system that's not meeting some expectation of the state. And there's been much talk there. There was a bill that is still floating out there in the General Assembly that the state superintendent of schools and the state Board of Ed have always had the legal authority to withhold 10% of all funding, of all state funding, if they feel like a Board of Ed or a school system's not complying, and provide notice and a chance to remedy it. And if they're not satisfied that it's been remedied, then they could withhold a second 10% of all funding. So, it starts out as 25% of new funding, but it could quickly get into tens of millions of dollars. That's never really been exercised much in history, and we're not. I think the superintendent, we're not saying that will happen. We're saying there's just a lot of unknowns and uncertainty right now as all of this moves forward. So some of it is just sort of trying to get guidance from them as we go, and seeing how it all works. We just turned in our first plan. That's one form of accountability. We have to report our expenditures on a monthly basis. That's a different part of accountability. So there's all these moving parts to how this thing's gonna work over the next 10 years. But the person who said, I think it was Cindy, said 10 years. It's a 10-year law unless it's extended or reauthorized. So that is at least the timeline we're looking at. And I think the superintendent in her remarks is saying it sure would be nice if they would say you don't have to comply fully in fiscal year 25, which is the go date, and could you phase this in over time? But none of us have heard that come out of any of our colleagues at the state level so far in meetings. You want me to stay close?
If nobody else is coming up, I just wanted to ask a follow-up question to that then. Then just based on the numbers, it doesn't make sense to me. Maybe I misunderstood, but it seems like the financial obligation that we would need to meet immediately is far greater than any kind of penalty that would come from the state.
Well, is Mr. Burke here? What can you yell out? What is our state funding roughly, and what, say, 10% of that would be in 24? So, sort of the entry level, I don't want to really, penalty might not be the right word. The way the blueprint works is the state's going to withhold 25% of new funding. So not all of, back up.
Okay.
Not all of state funding, 25% of the new funding that we would receive in a fiscal year. And so that's a much smaller number. But then if it becomes, this bigger picture of you haven't complied beyond, did we like your plan or did we agree with your plan, then that the discussion that's been pretty active in Annapolis is that they could withhold 10% of all state funding. And so in fiscal year 24, the one we're going into, that's approximately $180 million. So now those numbers are getting larger and larger. And to maybe what was your question, we don't have a sense that you could just say, I'll take the penalty, because that they have, the State Board of Ed has authority over public education in Maryland. So it's not, and don't think I haven't thought about that. Don't think I haven't asked our CFO, what would it be if we just took the penalty? But that's not realistically a viable option to just say we'll opt out of the blueprint. We'll take the fiscal penalty and move on. That's not going to be how this is going to work.
How you doing? I have a question, it's kind of more of a statement sort of thing. With talking to the commissioners, we've been basically, since we cut taxes over a decade ago, people have been asking them to even just restore them. Has that been discussions at minimum to get them restored back to what they were? Because, I mean, we've been robbing Peter to pay Paul, like you said, not just in the school system, but through all of our resources every year for a decade. And now with like fire and everything else coming into play, I went to a budget meeting this past, I guess last budget round, and I think we were already facing a deficit without this stuff of millions of dollars. But all the ink was in red. And usually when you see budgets and they're in red, it's not really a good solution. So are they giving you positive feedback of working towards something like that?
Well, I'm going to be really careful about what I say from up here. Okay. I'm going to be careful about what I say from here, but I will say that in our first joint meeting between the Board of Ed and the commissioners, that topic did come up, and we talked about the tax cuts that happened in 2013 and how that impacted the county and the school district. And so I know that they are talking internally, and that could end up being a discussion item with the community. But again, that's not mine to say. I just have to say what the need is, and then our commissioners make those tough decisions about how to try to fund everything that the community needs.
All right. Well, good evening, everyone. So in order to maintain status quo at our schools that are going to incur losses when you implement the blueprint, and meet the blueprint requirements, have you looked at how much local funding would need to increase in order to, meet that offset and what that would be?
Well, we've had lots of conversations about that with our CFO. Mr. O'Neill, do you want to take a stab at it?
Remember the conversation about what are variables and how many are there. So this doesn't take into account any of that. But just for the sake of the hypothetical conversation, if we wanted to leave the staffing that's in place today in every school and shift or add the resources necessarily to comply with the blueprint, that would be $37 million in funding next school year. The teacher salary example, the requirement to have a starting teacher salary of $60,000, that's subject to collective bargaining and some discussion and agreement there. But if you look at where our starting salary is today, it's a little over $50,000. To get to 60, that's roughly 20%. So unless my good friends and colleagues from the association here tonight would say, well, all we really need is to make everyone whose salary isn't 60 yet 60, which isn't likely, then to increase that scale by about 20% would be about $30 million. There's not much in there's money in the blueprint for the career ladder that the superintendent mentioned earlier. There's not real money in the blueprint beyond the base level foundation, what they call the foundation funding for salary. So much of that would be carried by the local government if it were to be. Teachers, we budget, and this is an average because you have salary and benefits and the part we pay to the pension system and Social Security and all those things. But we would budget a teaching position without a human being in it yet at $80,000 to $85,000 right now. So to add the 125 positions the superintendent mentioned to begin to phase in that 60-40 teacher time split, you'd multiply those numbers by 80 or 85 or 90 if you want to look a couple of years out as pension and Social Security and other costs go up. So those are the kinds of numbers that that you get to really quick. We haven't, superintendent didn't focus on special ed because we're probably largely in compliance there anyway, and the English language learner money is a much, much, much smaller pot. So if we're not in compliance there, it's probably more like $1 million or $2 million, not $48 million or $37 million. So, those are just the major points we're focusing on tonight. There's a lot more tied up here, but that that's the kind of money, and so that's why I think I would really feel comfortable if I could sit back down. But that's why I think the superintendent would say we're meeting as frequent. She's meeting as frequently as she can with the Board of Ed and the commissioners to try to frame this challenge that's in front of us as a system, as a community, and figure out what solutions exist, and keep hoping that there'll be some additional guidance from our colleagues at the state level. And she would never toot her own horn, but I will. She is doing endless outreach to the folks in charge at the state saying, please send folks here to give us much more specific guidance, technical assistance for how we can come into compliance in a way that makes sense. She does that relentlessly. So we'll hope that a lot of that comes to be true soon.
Good evening. I had a question for the statistics that went into the charts with the different students and staff ratios. So that was only based on the farms and ESLO students?
It's only based on the farm students. So it's only based on that $37 million that if we don't come up with any other way, this is an example of something that could happen. So it's only talking about the $37 million that we have to move from wherever it is today to certain schools.
So is there a reason why, because there was like the three categories that were in that 37, why is it only the farm students that were taken into account in this data?
Because as Mr. O'Neill said, that $37 million for farms or compensatory ed is our biggest concern right now. We're already, by and large, in compliance with the funding for special education services. And as Mr. O'Neill said, the funding that would have, the increased funding that would have to go to our English language learners, we're talking about $1 million or $2 million. It's the compensatory ed or the farms dollars that make up that $37 million that would require us to move staff around.
Oh, okay. And also, because this only has like moving teachers around, what qualifies for money that you can spend that 37 million on those students? Like, this only addresses teachers. Could it be for, like, any sort of things, transportation or buildings or anything like that?
It would need to be for resources for the school. I mean, it wouldn't be for buildings, but it could be for teachers, assistants, counselors. It could be for instructional materials. But we all know that we can't spend $37 million a year recurring for instructional materials. It always comes down to staff, since most of our budget is staff in a school system.
So I have a question just kind of for some clarity on the timeline. And the reason I'm asking is, we're at Linton Springs and we're trying to mobilize parents to support the Board of Ed and Superintendent's funding request. So the current request is the $6.7 million for fiscal year 24, which really starts July 1 of 23 for that school year. So, but we won't know if you guys get that until May-ish, probably. So if the state rejects the plan that was submitted in March, I don't know when you guys expect to hear back from the state regarding the plan. And then hopefully you'll get the funding. But looking ahead to next year, which is, I think, the more dire prediction, when the school estimates they'll need something like 37 million more. And same sort of thing, you guys will be submitting your next plan in March of 2024. At the same time that the commissioners are contemplating a larger budget request, and if they don't grant that request and the state rejects the plan, we're you know what I'm saying? I guess I'm trying to ask, like, what can we parents do? Like, should we be seeking even more money now in the county budget because the way these things overlap and don't quite match up? That, do you know what I'm saying?
You are exactly right. But the good news is that our commissioners, and in specific, Mr. Rothstein has said that, we won't stop talking about the budget after May. So even when FY24 is in the books and done for the funding for next year, we're not going to wait until next March or next January to start talking about funding. The commissioners, the Board of Ed, we all know that as soon as they decide their funding for us for this upcoming school year, we have to start the next discussion right away so that we know where we are and what we can anticipate so that we can write our plan appropriately.
And so there would be then perhaps a possibility that if the state provides feedback that rejects certain portions, whether of this current plan that was submitted in March 2023 or the next plan, that there's a course or a way that the Board of Ed can be revisiting additional budget requirements with the commissioners even during the fiscal year.
Absolutely, yes. We'll be staying in contact and making sure that as we get feedback that they know what that feedback is. And we have already agreed to meet quarterly as the two boards anyway. So these will be ongoing conversations.
Hi, thank you for speaking tonight. My question is about classroom sizes. Carroll County has had great success, as all of our scores have shown, and part of that is because our classroom sizes has always been low. Does the blueprint speak about class sizes? Do they care about class sizes? And in an ultimate world, what is a safe ratio for a child per adult in a school?
Mm-hmm. That's a really interesting question and one that we talk about all the time. When the Kirwan Commission first got together, which was the group of folks who wrote what is now the blueprint, they did a lot of research. They read a lot of the current research, and much of it was international research. And in the end, what they found and what they have told us is that class size is less of an indicator of student success than many other things. So, so I think that's one of the pieces that is in contention with certain folks, and I don't know that there's any agreement as to where is that level when you get to the point where it's detrimental. There is no agreement, but I can tell you that when you get to the point where you can't fit the desks in a classroom and students can't get out in case of an emergency or fire, that's a problem. And so, in many of our classrooms, it's hard to even fit 30 desks in those classrooms. And I have been going around looking to see what things look like. And I remember a lot of what things look like from COVID when I had to walk around classrooms and see what things looked like 3 feet apart and 6 feet apart and all of that. So there really is not any kind of agreement on at what point does class size get detrimental. But the folks in the Kirwan Commission made the decision that class size was not going to be one of the indicators that they took a look at.
Good evening, and thank you for coming out, because there's been a lot of things going around. I'm going to dig a little deeper, because I was around with Thornton. Okay, Thornton brought our full-day kindergarten, and with our full-day kindergarten, we lost an instructional assistant for each classroom. We had, when my son was there, we had larger class sizes. However, we had an instructional assistant in each kindergarten. Not to mention, we had some of moms that could go in and volunteer because we were doing some other things. We were creative, kind of tag team parenting, things like that. Husband would come home, I'd go out work. So as we look at all this, my concern is just in this area that feeds Liberty High School and Century High School, when we look at the feeder system, we're going to lose a little over 55 positions. That is more FTE than staffs our high school based on the data here. And I'm not questioning the data. My concern is we're going to full-day pre-K. When I was out talking about the full-day kindergarten, I recognized the fact that a 5-year-old didn't change physiologically. We're now talking 3- and 4-year-olds. Full day. When we put that in, I mean, when it comes to a budget, and I'm going to jump around a little bit because I got too much stuff bouncing around my head. But when we talk about a budget, it's taxes and which way do we cut the pie? Okay, what we're talking about here is operational budget. My concern, because I saw the capital hit on the kindergarten classrooms. Full day pre-K, what are we looking at for construction on that? The other thing, so when we look at that, then when we're moving staffing around into schools that are existing, when we look at out at Tawnytown, that middle school, I'm not sure of the renovations there, but were they planned for larger class size? That used to be an open enrollment school, if I'm not mistaken. So when we look at all this, we're talking operational hit, but when we're talking capital, that's local, a lot of local money, because the state, what do they, like, do they even come in 45% for us? And when we're talking as far as us being a rich county, that money comes in from the outside. Okay, most of your people that work inside Carroll County are not getting paid what people get paid on the other counties. And a lot of us, we go out, we come back. Free and reduced meal doesn't necessarily mean that that student's a low performer. Because I've seen a lot of very intelligent, it's just choices that their family makes for the best interests of their family. So, in looking at all this, I'm really concerned in that many times things are built in the air. And I'm afraid this is a situation not thrown on the locals, but it was started in Annapolis, coming out of a group that met pre-COVID. Our schools have changed since COVID. Our kids have changed since COVID. Our families have changed since COVID. I understand there's legislation out there, so there's a lot of questions, and no, I'm not running for anything. But when we look at this, our questions, there's a lot more to it than what we're seeing. And what I'm seeing, I'm really concerned, but I also know that there's a lot of things. If you can give us, as far as the pre-K, things like that, are they very clear with that? The other thing is, who makes up that state accountability and implementation board? What local control really remains? I saw it chiseled away, and now I'm thinking, it's even more. When we're talking as far as these staffing positions, are they based on the enrollment projections? And I know enrollment projections were 3 to 5 years. 5 years is still kind of sketchy at times, but we're really looking. I'm going to start looking in my neighborhood. Down this end, there's a lot of money comes up into the county. We're the most populated area, and we're taking the biggest hit. So, in looking at it, a lot of things, and again, I support you 100%. Okay? I just think we really need to be looking at this, and everyone else needs to be really looking at it, not blaming and pitting one group against the other. It doesn't work. What I'm saying is we all really need to look at this and then hold our people accountable and even talk to people in other counties, because they're going to have to do it too. Because Carroll County doesn't carry a whole lot of weight with the state, because we don't vote that way. But I think you need to really be looking out to others, because I think there's a lot more to the cost here, and to the detriment of our kids. Thank you.
I don't know if I made accurate mental notes, but so relative wealth, when the state refers to relative wealth for the funding formula, and this has been true way before Blueprint. This isn't new under the Blueprint funding formula, and it's more complex than this. Just everything we say is sort of a condensed version of much more complex topics. It's more complex than this, but in essence, it's a county's property tax base and local income tax base divided by the number of kids, public school kids in that county, and then they rank those. And so we consistently fall out somewhere around 9th or 10th in relative wealth. And then depending on your ranking of relative wealth, there's a cost share in all of the formulas. And so it's again, not precise, but it's probably somewhere around 60-40 for us if you looked over a long period of time, with the county picking up about 60% of that cost share on any of those formula columns, in the state 40 to 45 or something like that. Superintendent referred to the Kerwin Commission, which was the body that met at the state level that led to what became the Blueprint legislation. And I think she kind of got to this. That group started as a policy group, so it was sort of like, what does public education look like now, and what do we think public education should look like, with the belief that they would come back later, and they did, and develop a funding formula. So policy was developed separate from how much will it cost. So things like early childhood for 4 and 3-year-olds was a good concept, regardless of how much the formula should be for what it cost. And then to your question, wherever the previous speaker went, there was no thought given to the capital impact of any of that. So the state now has a work group as part of this General Assembly, and it'll carry forward beyond there, to look at the capital impact, starting with pre-K but also what about space for this 60-40 teacher time thing? And also, and we haven't really touched on it at all tonight because you would need like a week-long seminar on the blueprint, but there's a heavy career and technical education impact here, and our almost brand shiny new career and tech center doesn't meet what the blueprint would say you should have in place for career and tech. So there's tremendous capital impacts, which they're just now starting to explore. Locally, we try to get ahead of that, or we're trying to at least be somewhat ahead of that. And the Board of Ed has an operating budget. The Board of Ed also has some facilities or capital budget documents in our educational facility master plan where we try to plan out our buildings for 10 years in advance. The Board of Ed has authorized the first step of construction is a feasibility study from architects and engineers. So we're looking at a study to say what would it take and what would it cost and how feasible is it to build 2 pre-K classrooms at every elementary school that has a pre-K site already. And I think that's every elementary school except for Freedom Elementary. And that's our built-in assumption. Because we don't have enough time, but the whole pre-K thing is based on a belief that ultimately under the blueprint, there'll be a 50-50 public school system, private daycare provider share of those seats for 4- and 3-year-olds who meet certain income requirements as families. So there's a capital component. We are aware of it. It's a different budget piece, but it's still, there's still a lot to know there from the state level and then also locally. And if you had other questions, I forgot them by now. I'm sorry about that.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Kelly Gatsky. I just had a quick question. It's not entirely clear to me about what the state is trying to achieve with some of this blueprint. I mean, I think some of the things like increasing teacher salary, absolutely. But I'm also just looking at the cost. I'm on the side where I think class sizes, there is a tipping point where academics will be impacted. Again, part of the reason why I live here is because we have great schools and great academics, and that's extremely important to me as a member of this community. And I guess I'm just wondering if, are there going to be benchmarks along the way? If we do have to move staff, what is that impact really going to look like? And will we be able to, even if we can up front, make changes along the way? Or will it just simply be, okay, this is what we have to deal with for the next 10 years, and that's how it is? Thank you.
Well, we will continue to work on this. I would say that, even once we make the decision for FY25 of what staffing will look like and what resources would look like in each school, we're going to keep working each year to see, okay, what new funding are we able to obtain at the state or local level, and where can we put that to help the schools who we may have had to take some resources from. So we're not going to make a decision for FY25 and that's going to be it for the next 10 years. We will continue working on it for our staff and for our students' benefit. And to your first question, I would say, the Kerwin Commission tried to look at what they felt would benefit public education in the future, understanding that there are many districts in Maryland where, students are not making it. And, I would say even though we do a great job here, we're never satisfied either with where our students are. And we know our students could do better than they're currently doing. And we are, continuously trying to analyze data and improve the services we give. But I think when it really comes down to it, you can see what their thoughts were in the policy areas that they really looked at, which is getting kids into school earlier will help with their academics. Because I think the thought is when students come in kindergarten, there's already a great gap between, students who are ready for kindergarten and students who are not. So I think the thought was getting them earlier will be helpful for academic outcomes of some of our students. I think that professionalizing the teaching profession is another piece of the legislation. I think they're looking to draw new people into the teaching profession, and right now teachers are leaving the teaching profession, so in droves. So I think that the Kirwan Commission understood that in order to better public education, we have to have a professional teaching staff who are happy, who are healthy, who are knowledgeable and skilled and ready to meet the challenges that our students bring. I think the other piece of it is making sure that teachers have the time they need to plan for the strategic instruction that our students need. We hear a lot, and I can say as a former teacher and principal that the planning time that a teacher gets is not enough time to make sure that that instruction that's going to occur the next day is what each and every child in that classroom needs as far as first pass instruction and intervention goes. So I think that's part of what they were thinking is increasing planning time will increase and will better the instruction that our teachers are able to provide our students. And then I think finally the thought was, we have students right now who aren't doing as well. And some of the students who aren't doing as well as far as the statistics go are students who are English language learners, students who receive special education services, and students who receive free and reduced meals. On the whole, we have students in those categories who are not doing as well as other students. And so I think that the Kirwan Commission, believed that to put more resources into students that fall into those different categories would help them be able to achieve more in their public schooling. So I think that's where they were coming from. Like I said, it's always the hardest part is in implementation of any policy or any piece of legislation. And I think there's a lot of implementation consequences that we're working through right now. My hope is that, over the next 3 to 5 years, our Board of Education can work with the county commissioners and we can work with the state to figure out a way to implement this in a way that will help all of our students and not create situations where we have schools that have difficulty meeting the needs of students or have, too large class size, schools where they don't have as many guidance counselors because we're moving them away. That's what we really need to get together and try to come to a resolution on is how do we implement this without hurting some of our kids and our communities.
One of the previous questions was about the Accountability and Implementation Board. If you could speak to who is on that board and are all counties represented on that board?
Well, no is the easiest answer to that, but I'll let Mr. O'Neill.
The short answer is no, but in fairness to the question was, tell us a little bit more about what the Accountability and Implementation Board is and who is on that board, and does the composition of the board reflect all of Maryland's school systems? And I said the short answer to the last piece is no, it doesn't. And in fairness, the board is appointed by the governor, and so the current board as it exists today was appointed by Governor Hogan at that time, but the governor is limited to making in this case, his selections of who to choose from a nominating board that was appointed by what people call the presiding officers, which is essentially the president of the Maryland Senate and the Speaker of the House. And so they gave Governor Hogan a pool, and he appointed his choices from that pool. And they're slowly staffing up, and that's been another problem. They're new too, and trying to figure all this out and build a working staff. So they've had an executive director for over a year, and they're beginning to staff it out. So sometimes we're a little hard on them maybe about getting us guidance, but some of them are pretty new on the job as well. So, that's how that works, and they sort of sit separate from the State Board of Ed. So there's still the State Board of Ed with everything it's done, and now there's this AIB that meets as well to oversee the blueprint implementation. Where did you go? Did that answer questions?
On your second page of your presentation, second bullet, you talked about imposes state level control of educational policy. Where does that, how far down does that go as it relates to curriculum and the basic decision making at the local level? Like, does our own Board of Education have any, our Carroll County do they have any control anymore? Do they have any decision making authority?
So, Blueprint really doesn't get into curriculum. Blueprint gets into basically how we're spending our funding on different programs and different groups of students. So as far as curriculum goes and our guidelines and policies around curriculum, right now, and the way it's always been, is the state has state frameworks for each curriculum area, and then each district takes that framework, let's say for social studies, and fills it in with actual curriculum. So our teachers and our supervisors write our curriculum that our students get, but it's based on the state curriculum framework. So that's how it's always been, and that's how it is under the Blueprint as well. If you've been hearing anything about curriculum, that's probably related to House Bill 119, which is currently, it was cross-filed today from the House to the Senate, and we don't know what the outcome will be.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
One last question, sorry. Have we ever looked at, like, this is more like a budget specific thing, but when you look at these numbers, they seem like massively overwhelming. It was $100 million of expenses. Have you ever looked at, like, just breaking it down, like, how much does that impact the taxpayer, so we can further understand, like, what kind of true impact that is on our dollars? Because right here, it's kind of hard to see $30 million, $50 million, and just breaking that down, obviously that wouldn't be in your court, but that way when the commissioners do say, hey, we need to raise the tax base by this much, but it's going to cover this amount of money, and they always say, well, it can't all go to schools or whatever, but it potentially could. Just trying to understand those numbers, even if you can't give them today, maybe in a future presentation or something.
Yeah, well, we always want to stay in our lane, but be partners, and so that's a county function. But I'll say, and these are available online. All of this is, if you really have nothing else to do ever, you could watch meeting after meeting after meeting, even the Kerwin Commission. But if you go back to some of our fairly recent, because they're still in my memory, joint meetings with the commissioners that the superintendents referred to, the Board of Ed and the county commissioners meeting together, there were Commissioner Rostein's nodding. There were discussions about your question, and even some open public dialogue between the commissioners and their director of budget and management in real time on, what would, and I'm sort of recreating this from memory, but things like, what would a 1 cent increase in property tax yield, and those kinds of things, which kind of get to where you're going. But those are more county commissioner type, that's sort of their lane to be in, and their discussion to have. And we don't expect them to do student enrollment projections for us, and we don't suggest to them what their tax revenues are or could be. But in concert, yes, I think that's fair to say. Is it safe to say that these things have, they've looked at that and at least have some awareness of what is the fiscal dilemma facing Carroll County here, and it's pretty steep.
I do not envy your position. I just wanted to see if there's anything as parents that we can do as far as like writing the commissioners, writing the state. What can we do to get involved to try to help you guys implement this astronomical blueprint?
One thing you could do is just let our local legislators know that we're struggling with this, and that if they can do anything in the legislature to unrestrict some of the restricted funding that has to be used so that we could have more control locally over how we use the funding we get. Or, as Mr. O'Neill said, if we could have more time to implement this so that it all doesn't have to be perfect by FY25, Those are things you can talk with your local delegates about. And as far as the commissioners, Commissioner Rothstein, do you want me to have them write to you? I'm just kidding. He gave me a thumbs up, but I don't think he means it. You know, we're in constant communication with the commissioners. They know the situation we're in, and I think that, you know, they want to help us. It's going to be, I think, you know, a collaboration as to how that looks. You know, I would say, you know, yes, you can write to them and let them know, you know, your concerns. And I would also just, you know, watch and see the outcome of this budget season and then what happens in the next budget season. And I will try my best to keep the community apprised of where we are as far as being able to implement the blueprint requirements and where we need to be, so that, you know, something like this won't be the only time that you'll get explanations as to where we are. I just wanted us to be able to have a face-to-face before I start sending out other information over the next few years to keep the community apprised of where we are.
Okay. Yeah, I reached out to Marcia Herbert, and she said that, you know, she would get back. But I know her personally. I know like I said, I understand. I can't imagine, you know, you guys haven't had a lot of time. When did you receive this information from the state?
I mean, we knew Blueprint was coming, but we didn't know what it was going to look like. You know, it was released in 2022, you know, formally. So until then, we really kind of just heard what it was going to entail, but, you know, we just got it in 2022.
Understood. Well, thank you.
Yes, absolutely.
That was a really good question, because in January, I met our new governor, Governor Moore. I sit on MACO, the Maryland Association of Counties Board, and he asked everybody in this room, there were 16 of us from each one of from 16 of the jurisdictions, how many of you were part of developing this plan? One person raised their hand because they were on that committee. So it was all new to us. So it was a really important question, and there's still a lot of questions out there. Like the superintendent said, share your concerns with the legislators, with the delegates and senators. I'm not pushing away from me. There's two different responsibilities. Share them with the legislators because we've got to work to unrestrict those funds. That compensatory education and those silos have got to be less restrictive so we can use those funds for other things. Understanding our responsibility, you know, the $6.7 million, the way we do our budget process is open. And we've had one or two sessions already. We're going to have another one on Thursday. You're all welcome to watch. You're all welcome to share with us your views, not during the work sessions, but either before or after. Call me, call the other, my colleagues. Let us know the importance of that $6.7 million that's been shared by the superintendent and the Board of Education. What it actually means, not specifically to Kerwin, but to get us through this next fiscal year. And the last thing I'll say is, just like the superintendent said, we're a team. You know, Carroll County knows, you know, Carroll Countyans is the best way to do this, and working together, we will be working the budget process for FY25 as soon as FY24 begins. So in other words, June, July, because we got to come up with a plan. That $30+ million is a daunting cliff that's in front of us. Taxes, nothing is off the table. I'm not a proponent of it. I want to be fiscally conservative and use those terms, live within our means. But the challenge is there's a daunting task in front of us. So I'm going to put everything on the table, work with my colleagues, and come up with what's the best plan. You're going to be a part of that. You're going to help us get through that. So just want to share a few of my thoughts with you. But thanks.
Sorry, Ms. McCabe, I can't keep my mouth shut.
Board President Herbert.
Hi, I'm Marcia Herbert, and I cannot thank you enough for showing up today. When I made my comments 2 months ago, and I meant it, parents, you need to pay attention because Carroll County Board of Education will not look the same. And it's not because of our employees, it's because of money. And I cannot thank our employees enough, our educators, our instructional assistants, our custodians, everyone, our secretaries they go beyond what we ask them every year. And we get the biggest bang for our buck because of our educators. We are always in the top for academics, and that is really concerning me. With the blueprint, they've really not talked about academics, and they have not talked about class size. And that's very concerning for me because I taught for over 40 years. I know what class size can do. And you do not, it doesn't work well when you have 45 or 50 in a class. And I just cannot thank you all enough that people are paying attention to a very big problem we are going to have. And I want to continue to work on academics. That is what we're here for. We are here to teach our students. And I just cannot thank you enough. And this is going to be a long, hard road. We don't know everything, but the bottom of it is the money, and that's the evil part. And we will have to work together with the commissioners and the delegation because this is where this all started. We didn't mandate this. The commissioners didn't mandate this either. And we are here to solve these problems. But I want to thank you all so much to see such a great number of parents and educators, employees here tonight that showed up for their concern because we have got to work all this together. I'm an old Carroll County girl, lived here all my life, and I know why people come to Carroll County. We have a great county. We live here, we work here, and we get really good education here. And I cannot thank you enough. And I can't run anymore because I'm almost finished on the Board of Education. But thank you all for really coming. And I cannot thank Ms. McCabe and her whole staff that's here tonight because they're doing 2 jobs. They're doing Blueprint plus running the school system. A lot of counties have special groups that are just doing Blueprint. All of our people over there are sitting there tonight and here, and they're doing double duty. So I didn't know if you all knew that or not, but that's what's going on in this system. We're running a top-notch school system, plus then we're trying to work out the Blueprint problems. But thanks again. I really appreciate you all coming, and have a good evening. And I'm going to start, but you know I couldn't keep my mouth shut, but I had to thank everybody because this is a great attendance. Thank you.
Okay, we have time for a couple more questions.
I just had one question. Will at the state level, will the AIB, or even at the local level, will there be some provision for looking at outcomes to this plan?
You know, that hasn't been discussed in the information that we've received so far. My thought is that at some point, they will start to look at the student achievement outcomes after this has been implemented. But on the front end, that hasn't been a part of the plan.
Thank you for staying so late tonight. So to come back to maybe some hard numbers, you might want to be cautious with your words, but I don't have that restriction. So there was a report in the Carroll County Times from one of those joint meetings you spoke of back in January, and the relevant numbers were 13.4 million was the ask, and Commissioner Yu indicated that devolved down to a 3 cent per $100 assessment across the county to achieve that number. So we're talking about larger numbers tonight, but just to use that as the appropriate scaling, the 37 million target, which is a nice, easy number to completely ameliorate all the negative consequences, at least in the first part of the implementation. That works out to a little over 8 cents, 8.25 or so per $100 of assessment, which sounds scary, right? The middle of the housing sale price distribution in Carroll County is round number $400,000. That's the sale price roughly, not the assessment, so there's a little conservatism built in there. all that multiplies out to about $330 a year, $27 a month to meet that goal and, as you said, ameliorate most of the negative consequences here. Sir, if the commissioners were to put together a proposal to do just that, I only speak for myself, I would support it.
Me too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I'd like to thank everyone for coming out tonight. This is certainly not a conversation I wanted to have in my first year as superintendent, but I think it was definitely an imperative one. Again, thanks for coming out and thank you for your support. Please feel free to contact us as you have questions and further concerns.